I was sitting in that boardroom with my hands folded in my lap, completely still, watching my brother smirk at me from across the table like he'd already won, and maybe he thought he had. He had a lawyer. He had my parents sitting right beside him. He had a stack of documents that, if you believed them, painted me as unstable, irresponsible, and unfit to inherit a single cent of what my grandmother had left behind. What he didn't know was that I'd been ready for this moment for 6 months. Let me back up. My grandmother passed away in March, 2 days after the first real thaw of the year. She was 81, sharp until the very end, and she had spent the last decade of her life building something she was genuinely proud of, a small but profitable property portfolio in the Okanagan, a renovated heritage duplex in Victoria that she rented out at below market rate because she believed in giving young families a fair shot, and a lakeside cottage in Muskoka that had been in our family since before I was born. She wasn't rich by Bay Street standards, but she was comfortable, and she had worked for every bit of it herself after my grandfather died young, and left her with 2 kids and a mortgage. She left it to me. All of it. Not split down the middle. Not divided between her children. To me, her granddaughter, with a letter tucked inside the will that explained exactly why. I'd been the one who called her every Sunday. I'd been the one who drove up to Muskoka every Thanksgiving even when work was brutal and I was exhausted. I'd been the one who sat with her through her hip surgery, who learned how to manage her medication schedule, who helped her research her tenant rights when a property management company tried to bully her into a contract she didn't understand. My brother had visited twice in 5 years. My parents had a complicated relationship with her that I never fully understood. There was old money tension, old grievances I wasn't privy to, and she had chosen, deliberately and clearly, to leave her life's work to the person she trusted most. That person was me. And my brother decided, the moment the will was read, that this was unacceptable. He's 4 years older than me. He's a financial advisor, or he was at that point. He has always had our parents' ear in a way I never quite did. I was the artistic one, the one who went into landscape architecture instead of something with a clearer income trajectory, the one who took a few years longer to get stable. In our family's internal mythology, I was a bit of a question mark, and he was the success story. Our parents never said it out loud, but you could feel it in the room, the way they deferred to his opinions, the way they softened their voices when they talked about my choices. When the will came out, he told them I had manipulated her, that I had isolated her, that I had leveraged her vulnerability during her final years to position myself as the sole beneficiary, and that this was not what she actually wanted. It was what I had engineered. My parents believed him. Or at least, they chose his version of events. I'll never entirely know if they believed him, or if they simply couldn't accept that their mother had made a choice that didn't include them. Either way, they stood behind him. And then they hired a lawyer. The first sign that something was coming was a phone call from my mother in late April. She asked if I was doing okay. She asked if I'd been under a lot of stress lately. She mentioned, carefully, that she'd heard I'd been having trouble sleeping, that I'd seemed overwhelmed at the funeral. I hadn't seemed overwhelmed. I had cried. I had cried because my grandmother died and I loved her. But I heard something in my mother's voice, a probing quality, like she was building a case file. A week later, my brother texted me asking if we could meet for coffee. He was warm, warmer than he'd been in years. We met at a place on King Street, and he told me he was worried about me. He said our grandmother's death had hit us all hard, and he wanted to make sure I was getting support. He mentioned, offhand, that he'd spoken to his own therapist about the situation and that the therapist had said grief could manifest in unusual ways, ways that might affect someone's judgment. I nodded and said I appreciated his concern. I paid for my own coffee, and I drove home and I sat in my car in the parking garage for about 10 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel. That was when I understood what was happening. They were constructing a narrative, and they were going to use it. I want to be clear that I didn't do anything dramatic in response. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call a lawyer that same afternoon in a panic. I just went home, made dinner, and thought carefully. And then the next day, I called a friend of mine who practices estate law in Toronto, and I told her the whole story. She listened, she asked a few questions, and then she said, "Start documenting everything, now." So I did. I started keeping a journal, time-stamped, detailed, with screenshots of every text and a log of every phone call. When my mother called to ask about my mental health, I wrote it down. When my brother sent me an article about grief counseling services, I wrote it down. When my father called and gently suggested that maybe it would be better for everyone if the estate was sold and divided equally, and that this was probably what my grandmother would have actually wanted, I wrote that down too and noted the exact wording. I also quietly reached out to my grandmother's lawyer, to her next-door neighbor in Muskoka who had known her for 20 years, to the pharmacist she'd seen regularly, and to the GP who had been managing her care in her final 2 years. I wasn't trying to build a case yet. I was trying to understand what they knew, what they'd observed, and whether any of them had been contacted by my family. The pharmacist hadn't. The neighbor hadn't. The GP's office had received a request from someone claiming to be a family representative, asking about her recent cognitive assessments. They had not shared anything, but the request had been made. That was in May. In July, things escalated. I came home to my apartment one evening to find that someone had been inside. Nothing was stolen, but things had been moved. My filing cabinet drawer was slightly open. My laptop had been shifted a few inches on the desk. A stack of papers near my grandmother's correspondence had been disturbed. I live alone. I had not had anyone over. I changed my locks the next morning and I called my friend the lawyer. She said, "Do you have a Ring camera or anything like that?" I didn't. But I got one installed within 48 hours, front door, back door, and one small device in my home office that a security consultant recommended. Nothing fancy, just consistent, time-stamped coverage. 3 weeks later, my brother called to tell me that he and my parents had engaged legal counsel and were formally contesting the will. He said they weren't doing it out of greed. They were doing it because they were genuinely concerned about the circumstances under which it had been drafted, and because they believed my grandmother had not been of fully sound mind in her final year. He said he hoped I understood that this wasn't personal. I said I understood. I thanked him for letting me know. I hung up and I cried for about an hour. Not because I was surprised, but because there is something genuinely devastating about realizing that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are willing to drag you through a legal process over money. It doesn't matter how prepared you are, it still lands like a punch. But I got up, and I kept documenting. The legal process moved the way legal processes do in Ontario, slowly with a lot of paper and a lot of waiting. My grandmother's lawyer confirmed that she had been assessed by 2 independent physicians in the 18 months before she passed, both of whom had documented that she was cognitive competent and fully capable of making decisions regarding her estate. The will had been drafted and witnessed properly. The notation in her letter was clear and specific. Their legal team argued that I had exerted undue influence, that I had been her primary caregiver in a way that gave me disproportionate access and leverage, that the relationship between us, while appearing affectionate, was in fact controlling. My lawyer called it the most cynical framing she'd encountered in years, because what they were arguing was that being a good granddaughter, calling every week, showing up, caring was actually evidence of manipulation. That love, in their version, was a tactic. I thought about that a lot in the months leading up to mediation. How the same facts can be framed 2 completely different ways. How a phone call can be maintaining contact or monitoring her. How presence can be support or isolation. Language is a tool, and they were using it carefully. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday in November. I remember it was gray and cold, one of those Toronto November days that feels like the city has given up on warmth entirely. I drove myself there. I wore a navy blazer over a white shirt, and I brought a folder with every document I had, organized by date. My brother was already there when I arrived. He was in a suit I hadn't seen before. He looked confident. My parents were seated beside him, my mother with her hands clasped, my father looking slightly uncomfortable, like a man who had committed to a decision and was now trying not to second-guess it. Their lawyer was a woman in her 50s who had the practiced stillness of someone who had done this many times and felt nothing about it anymore. I sat down across from them. My lawyer sat beside me, and we began. They had prepared a document, a thick one. It included a summary of what they characterized as my pattern of behavior over my grandmother's final years. It included a statement from a cousin I barely knew who said she had noticed my grandmother seemed less communicative at a family event 2 years before her death, an event I hadn't even attended. It included a letter from my brother describing a phone call in which he believed my grandmother had seemed confused and not herself, and in which she had, according to him, expressed doubts about the estate arrangements. No date on the letter, no independent corroboration, just his account. Their lawyer presented all of this in a calm, measured voice. She referenced a section of the Succession Law Reform Act. She spoke about the legal standard for testamentary capacity and the threshold for demonstrating undue influence. She was smooth, and I could tell she had done exactly this before. I sat still and I let her finish. Then my lawyer spoke. She began by submitting the 2 physician assessments, then the notarized statement from my grandmother's longtime neighbor, a woman who had known her for 2 decades and who described, in specific and dated detail, the conversations she had had with my grandmother about her wishes, including one that had taken place just 4 months before she died, in which my grandmother had been entirely clear about her intentions and had expressed no ambiguity whatsoever. Then she submitted the phone records, every call I had made to my grandmother over the last 3 years, with dates and durations. She noted that no calls had been made from my brother's number in the 14 months preceding our grandmother's death. There was a pause across the table. Their lawyer looked at the documents. My brother's jaw moved slightly. My mother looked at the table. But my lawyer wasn't done. She said there were additional materials she needed to introduce, and she pulled out a second folder. Inside were printed transcripts, and I want to explain how they came to exist, because this is the part that matters most. About 2 months before the mediation, I had received an unexpected visit from my brother. He had come to my apartment, unannounced, on a Saturday afternoon. He said he was in the neighborhood. He said he just wanted to talk, without lawyers, without pressure, like siblings. I let him in because I hoped that maybe something had shifted. We sat at my kitchen table. He had coffee, and he talked. He talked for almost an hour. He told me what he was actually worried about, which was not our grandmother's mental state, which he acknowledged privately had been fine, but the money. He had debts. He was not going to tell me what kind, but they were serious, and he needed access to liquidity in the next 8 months. He said if I just agreed to sell the Victoria property and split the proceeds with the family, he'd drop the contest. He said he'd make sure our parents followed along. He said he was sorry it had come to this. He said he genuinely believed it would all be fine if I just cooperated. And then he said something that I wrote down verbatim as soon as he left. I don't actually think you did anything wrong. I just need this to work out differently. I had been recording the entire conversation on my phone, which was face down on the kitchen counter about 4 feet away. Audio only. I had started it the moment I heard his knock at the door, because by November I had stopped assuming that anything was accidental. The transcript was 38 pages. My lawyer had read every word. She placed it in front of their lawyer without comment and waited. The room went very quiet. My brother looked at me. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I had nothing to say. He had said it all himself, in my kitchen, in his own voice. Their lawyer asked for a recess. They got 15 minutes. When they came back, the energy in the room was completely different. My mother was pale. My father was looking at his hands. My brother was looking at nothing. The contest was withdrawn that afternoon, all of it, in writing, with their signatures. The estate passed to me in full, as my grandmother had intended. I won't pretend there was anything triumphant about the drive home. I sat in traffic on the DVP and I felt mostly numb. Relieved, yes, but also just sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that the person who had talked to my kitchen table for an hour and told me privately that he knew he was wrong was the same person who had spent 7 months trying to take something from me to a legal system that runs on paper and framing. My parents called me a week later. My mother cried. She said she'd been put in an impossible position. She said she had always believed me, but family was family, and she hadn't known what else to do. I listened. I didn't argue with her account of events, but I also told her honestly that I needed time before I could have a normal relationship with either of them. I wasn't angry, or I was, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that I had learned something about what they were willing to do, and I couldn't unknow it. My brother, I haven't spoken to since. What I did with the estate is exactly what my grandmother hoped I would. The Muskoka cottage I kept. I go up there in August and I let my friends use it in the shoulder seasons, the way she always did. The Victoria duplex I still rent at a fair rate. I found tenants who needed it. A young couple, both working in healthcare. I met them once and they reminded me of something she had said once, that a home is not just square footage in a lease, it's the start of a life someone is trying to build. The Okanagan property I sold, but not before I earmarked a portion of the proceeds to endow a small bursary at a local college in her name. She had never finished her own degree. She always said she wished she had. Now, there is a fund that helps mature students cover tuition in the trades programs, and it has her name on it, and I think that is the closest thing to right I have been able to do. She knew what she was doing when she wrote that will. She wasn't confused. She wasn't being manipulated. She was a woman who spent 81 years paying attention, and she knew exactly who had been paying attention back. I think about that sometimes, how much of life is simply that: showing up, calling, staying present in small, unglamorous ways when it would be easier not to. My grandmother noticed. She didn't leave her estate to the most impressive person in the family. She left it to the one who showed up. And no document, no lawyer, no reframing of the truth was ever going to change what she knew when she made that choice. I keep coming back to something my grandmother said once, years before any of this happened. We were sitting on the dock at the Muskoka cottage, late August, the kind of evening where the light goes gold and slow and you feel like time has briefly agreed to stop rushing. She said, "The people who show up quietly are the ones worth trusting. Anyone can make a grand gesture. It's the ordinary Tuesday that tells you everything." I didn't write it down at the time. I didn't need to. It lodged somewhere and stayed. What happened in that boardroom in November wasn't really about money, even though money was the surface of it. What it was about, what I've come to understand it was about, is the difference between who you actually are and who other people find it convenient for you to be. My brother needed me to be the manipulative one. My parents needed me to be the unstable one. The story they were building required a version of me that didn't exist, and they were willing to stake a legal claim on it. What dismantled that story wasn't strategy, exactly. It was just consistency. I had shown up for my grandmother for years, not because I expected anything from it, but because I genuinely loved her and she was worth showing up for. That consistency created a record. Every Sunday call, every drive north, every appointment I sat through with her, all of it existed in verifiable, documented form before I ever knew I would need it to. You can't manufacture that after the fact. You either did it or you didn't. I think about my brother in my kitchen that Saturday, the coffee going cold, him telling me in his own words that he knew he was wrong but needed it to go differently anyway. There's something almost tragic about that. A person who can see clearly what's right and still choose to move in the opposite direction because the financial pressure is too loud to ignore. I don't say that to excuse what he did. I say it because understanding it is how I've managed to put it down and not carry it around forever. The hardest part of this whole experience wasn't the legal process. It was learning that love within a family is not unconditional just because everyone assumes it is. My parents stood in that room and chose a version of events they knew on some level wasn't true. That takes something from you, not permanently, but it takes it. And rebuilding after that is its own slow, unglamorous work. What I've landed on, in the time since, is this: the only things that actually protect you in moments like these are the things you've already done, the integrity you've practiced before anyone was watching, the clear-headedness to document and prepare without panic, to think through next steps instead of reacting, The willingness to hold on through a 7-month process that was exhausting and expensive and sometimes felt unwinnable. None of those things showed up the day I needed them. They were built slowly and, without fanfare, over years of just trying to be someone worth trusting. My grandmother knew that. She saw it before I did. The bursary in her name is small. It won't change the world. But every time I see it listed, I think about a woman who worked through genuine hardship to build something real and who trusted the right person to carry it forward. That trust was the last gift she gave me. I intend to be worthy of it for a long time yet.